being recorded. Do I
Yeah,
click
you heard it as well, right?
Yes, but I've got a thing in the middle of the screen saying it's being recorded. Leave meeting or continue.
Yeah, you have to agree.
I click on continue then. Nothing says agree. So
Okay, I'll continue, yes.
And it's gone.
Ну что, коллеги, мы будем начинать. Всем здравствуйте. У нас сегодня не совсем обычная лекция. У нас сегодня лекция встречи с нашим почетным гостем, который сейчас находится в Афинах в Греции, но преподает в университете Гульермо Маркони в Италии, а сам является англичанином. Вот такая вот глобализация, да. Мы приветствуем нашего гостя Уильяма Меллинсона. Я скажу буквально пару слов про Уильяма, хотя вы могли прочитать аннотацию на сайте, да. Уильям Меллинсон – это бывший британский дипломат, специалист в области истории холодной войны, в истории, политической истории Европы XX века, автор множества книг по международным отношениям, по истории международных отношений, по политике в Восточном Средиземноморье, по истории НАТО, член редколлегии довольно крупного журнала «Балканские и ближневосточные исследования» в издательстве Routledge. И вот сегодня у нас лекция называется «Геоистория. Как история помогает лучше понять отношения между государствами». Я уже анонсировал вам, когда давно еще объявлял, что Уильям к нам придет в гости, да, что у него вот есть очень интересная концепция геоистории, которая отличается от понятия геополитики и нацелена на то, чтобы как использовать историю для анализа международных отношений. Я не буду углубляться, потому что Уильям сам все прекрасно расскажет. И вот зенитом его исследований по этой теме стала буквально недавно, этим летом, вышедшая книга. Это, наверное, самый крупный его труд, который называется «Guicciardini. Геополитика и геоистория, изучая отношения между государствами», в которой Уильям как раз систематизировал свои все направления, которые он нарабатывал в течение многих лет. Да, и вот очень интересно посмотреть, какое место теория это занимает в той иерархии, скажем так, теорий, да, о которых мы с вами говорили, классических теориях, таких как реализм, либерализм, конструктивизм и так далее. И, на мой взгляд, эта теория, возможно, ближе к конструктивизму на самом деле, да, но с определенными оговорками. Я считаю, что Уильям по-настоящему является социологом международных отношений, да, потому что он выступает с точки зрения вот такого многокритериального анализа и не смотрит на международные отношения как на что-то простое и одномерное, что нужно анализировать, наоборот, с разных точек зрения, учитывать и социальные процессы, учитывать и экономические процессы, учитывать политические отношения между государствами, и все это пропускать вот через призму истории. Не побоюсь этого слова, на мой взгляд, Уильям один из самых оригинальных мыслителей в области международных отношений сегодня. Вот, я думаю, что будет интересно. Значит, я предупреждаю, что лекция будет преимущественно на английском языке. Все об этом, в общем-то, знают. Да, я иногда, если нужно будет, могу включаться и что-то комментировать, и как бы краткие мини-итоги, да. Вот, но и вы, кстати, не бойтесь перебивать лектора, если у вас тоже возникают какие-то вопросы по ходу, пожалуйста, задавайте. Вы можете задавать вопросы как на русском языке, так и на английском. Вы можете писать в чат здесь у нас тоже как на русском, так и на английском языке. Если вы на русском, я просто переведу, никаких проблем здесь нету. Вот, значит, у нас построим таким образом, примерно час времени мы дадим Уильяму, да, и потом у нас останется время на спокойную дискуссию, вопросы, ответы, может быть, ваши комментарии какие-то. Вот, поэтому, пожалуйста, не стесняйтесь в дискуссии участвовать. Собственно, наверное, я здесь остановлюсь и передам слово нашему замечательному гостю. William, I just made a short introduction of your work and of yourself, and now I'm happy to give the floor to you. Please, if you want to ask questions to the audience, or if you want to involve students into the lecture, please go ahead. So please, the floor is yours.
With pleasure. Firstly, let me ask, you mentioned two departments. What are the two departments who are here? So I can relate to the thinking behind them.
Well, it's in general, it's the Faculty of Sociology, but I think we have students from most of departments at the faculty. So it's contemporary sociology, history of sociology, political science, economic sociology and management, the sociology of family and demography, and
thank you.
State management. I mean. All layers of sociological knowledge are here.
A broad church. Thank you. Well, this reminds me of a chap called Lin Yutang, who said that a man's love for definitions is a step towards ignorance because he tries to achieve an impossible logical perfection. Now, that's a pretty strong statement because, of course, we all need categories to organize ourselves because we're not perfect. This connects now to one of the reasons why I had to write this book, as much for myself as for other people. Now, the idea struck me about 10 years ago when I first heard the name Guicciardini. I had not even heard of him before, except very vaguely in certain contexts as a historian. And I then juxtaposed this, compared this, put it next to the name Machiavelli. Now, Machiavelli was and still is all the rage. And I noticed that Machiavelli attracted very much political realists and geopoliticians. And I then began to look rather deeper into the whole question. But bearing in mind that I'm essentially and academically a historian, and I deal mainly only with real documents. I like to feel these documents in my hand and smell them and look at side comments and look at the history of the documents and over a large number of years to see how all these people working for a state are thinking and why they're writing what they write. Now, just to present the book in a few seconds before I dig deeper. The first chapter is an explanation. The second chapter is who is Guicciardini. The third one is the war of the theories. The fourth one is geopolitics and the politicization of geography, because I think that geopolitics has almost destroyed the traditional concept of geography. I can see a picture of a nice young lady, by the way, in front of me, but you've gone away. That doesn't matter, does it? No, fine. Chapter 5 is the casualties, some casualties, victims of geopolitics. And I compare Cyprus and Iraq, both of which were controlled by the Ottomans and the British. So that was the connection between an island on the one hand and a large Middle Eastern state on the other hand. Chapter 6 is my explanation of what I mean by geohistory. 7, which seems to be rather popular, is the effects of globalization. It is all connected. And finally, the ricordi of Guicciardini, all his memories, and what I say about memory. Now, to give you the mental underpinning, the mental basis of the book, which is so important, we have to turn to a very simple, you might think too simple, definition of history. Because I argue that only history exists in its purest form, which is the past. So I equate history to the past. Then you have the study of it, but they're connected. Now, I also argue that the present is becoming history as I speak. Things always flow. As the ancient Greeks said, ta panda ri, everything flows. So history is therefore with us as I speak. In a few seconds, or even as I speak, it's already become the past. The future cannot technically exist, of course, at this second, but we think of it all the time. So I equate the future simply to future history, to our imagination, our assumption. So that is a very simple definition of what I see as history being terribly, terribly important, and understanding history even more important. Now, we all know how history, above all, is used and exploited by all manner, excuse me, of ideologists to make their own point. History is picked at, cherry picked. People take a bit and then they miss out a bit to suit their own political or social or personal purpose. That, by the way, is one of the connections to what I call geohistory, which is totally non-ideological. Anyhow, so I've given you a very basic mental underpinning. Remember that all of us, I think, are frightened of being naked, both physically, but also mentally. And to say something very simple and obvious is sometimes embarrassing, even to me, to say something obvious. And so we often avoid the obvious and hide in too many definitions and too many theories. Now, talking about relations between states, as opposed to international relations, because the word national is very flexible, as I shall say later. Talking about interstate relations, let me quote, of all people, Bismarck. International relations, as opposed to interstate relations, has become not only a Western phenomenon, and a fairly recent subject, by the way. It's only a little more than 100 years old, if that, academically speaking, the study of it in name. It's quite a young academic discipline, but it has been taken over, rightly or wrongly, very much by the English language. And this, of course, has infiltrated, not necessarily in a bad way, into Russia, even China, possibly Japan, because of the plethora, the huge mass of books that began to appear mainly after the last war, the last World War, with normative influences and with behavioral sciences infiltrating onto what was once the study of simply relations between states. Now, let me quote Bismarck. Bismarck said, Count Otto von Bismarck, he said that the most significant event of the 20th century would be the fact that the North Americans spoke English. But I say, no one has yet said that the most significant event of the 21st century is the fact that the English speak North American, or at least they're beginning to, with increasing speed, the English themselves. In this way, American ideas, and I'm not saying they're all bad, but they've spread everywhere. And this has surely affected even interstate relations, because when you look at the education and the background of many people who are involved in helping to run a state, whether they're politicians, elected politicians, or whether they are unelected civil servants, state servants, they're all influenced in some way, either subliminally without knowing, and sometimes consciously, and many of them are ideological. In that connection, again, history comes. Let me quote the Foreign Office in 1947, commenting on the beginning of the Cold War, and the British ambassador in the United States said that the missionary strain, the missionary elements in the character of Americans leads many of them to feel that they have now received a call from God, maybe, to extend to other countries the blessings with which God has given them. Now, this was a clever British diplomat saying that the Americans are missionary. Everything's good, so they want to give it to the world. Well, what's the difference between good and bad? Does it mean you export freedom to Iraq? Is that making Iraq good? It hasn't. It's had the opposite effect. All of this, of course, I connected almost immediately, almost spastically, to geopolitics, which I shall deal with later, because this is only a very initial, perhaps slightly confusing, but thoughtful introduction to what I'm going to say. And now I'll become a little more precise slowly. Let me say what I've written to summarize my book. It's a few lines. The book shows that geohistory, and some would say history, is a more effective concept than geopolitics in understanding, and I stress the word understanding, not necessarily solving, but understanding interstate relations at a time of confusion in world affairs, because world affairs are confusing at the moment for a number of reasons, one being the information explosion, and there are many others which we can discuss later. And I identified Francesco Guicciardini's thoughts as a good medium to demonstrate not only the inadequacies, the failings of geopolitics, but that a geohistorical approach can be a more responsible way of understanding international affairs. So it's a fresh approach. It is based, I have to say, and this is the first crucial point you may wish to write down, on the individual. I do not mean the individual in a selfish, me first way at all, but I say that everything can only begin from an individual's memory, because it is on this individual, on all these individuals, that corporate characteristics depend. You cannot have corporate characteristics without the individual. People forget that. It's terribly important to begin with the individual memory, with the, if you like, with bipedic memories, two-legged memories. That's all people are. And some of them remember something, some don't, some choose, and it goes on from there. So there's a strong element of psychology in this as well. Now, these corporate characteristics and the individual human behavior are often translated into state interests. But these state interests cannot on their own predict actions which are driven by human behavior, because human behavior is not completely predictable. No psychologist can say with 100% certainty what a human being will do in a year's time. So the other thrust of the book is to show how mainstream international relations theories are stuck in mental paradigms, in mental prisons, and they are not sufficient in explaining why world politics, and now I'm quoting Pavel Kanievsky, they are not sufficient to explain why world politics is moving in a direction that nobody could predict even 1 decade ago. The book shows how ideology can blur, can confuse clear understanding. So that is a very brief overall summary of the book. And now I'll move further into our specific themes. And let's see who of you can guess who wrote this. History is the life of nations and humanity. to seize, to grab and put into words, to describe directly the life of humanity or even of a single nation appears impossible, because history, for history, lines exist of the movement of human wills, what humans want, one end of which is hidden in the unknown, but at the other end of which a consciousness of man's will in the present moves in space, time, and dependence on cause. Do any of you know who wrote that? If not, I can tell you. Pavel might, but I shall say Leo Tolstoy. Leo Tolstoy wrote it. And that comes towards the end of my book. But people forget Tolstoy to their detriment quite often. That is why I turn to human characteristics, because men are not only ruled by reason. They like to think so. They like to have their logical diagrams and models and themes. They like it. And they then, without knowing, become a slave to their theme and their model and their ideas. I haven't yet worked out myself whether I am a slave to my own book, but at least geohistory is not a theory, and it will never be a theory. It'll be an approach to thinking. Now, thus, therefore, we have to turn to human characteristics, individual. I keep repeating this. If we can better understand why relying too much on state interests, what people call national interest, is exaggerated in the analysis of interstate relations, because most of the theories, including realism, depend on stressing the importance of the national interest. But the national interest is very difficult to define simply because the very concept of nation is difficult to define, and people use the word nation and nation state almost interchangeably. Almost interchangeably. I'm stopping there because there's a message here in Russian. Vaikhao C406, Pavel.
No, William, it's me actually. I'm trying to follow your your lecture and post something in Russian.
You're a genius. So I'll wait for you to talk a bit in Russian to say what I
said.
No,
I'm actually writing it on the chat. No
okay,
need to interrupt you.
You interrupt me whenever you want. It's a free world, and you have a right to do that. Now then, so what I'm saying is the unquestioning acceptance of state interests as a starting point for understanding is misplaced, because beyond that, it's the characteristics of greed, pride, vanity, jealousy, anger, insecurity, prejudice, ambition, and idealism, which determine the state of humanity and state interests. So to understand state interest, you have to go much, much deeper. State interest has now become a mantra, a slogan, international relations. Therefore, the state itself, per se, is the only tool that I can use without emotion in order to understand the diverse and different groups that inhabit a single state. And there are very few states which have only one ethnic group or one religious group in the world, very few. Nearly every single state consists of nations, groups, etc. So I prefer to deal only with that, with the state. That's why my book is Interstate Relations. Then there's no argument. We know what a state is. It's a member of the United Nations with hopefully defined and agreed borders. Although, as we know, sometimes that's disputed by a neighboring state. That's the nature of atavism, which is crucial, and people's memories. Now, with this focus on the state in order to analyze all this with geohistory, we do not need to alienate, we do not need to separate group from group through the exploitation of identity politics, over categorization and nationalism, because the state is the only guarantee against chaos And there I agree with some of the more moderate realists, by the way. The state is the only guarantee we have against complete anarchy, and the bad side of anarchy, I mean, and chaos in an increasingly confused world of emotional, political, and ideological isms. There's an obsession with isms wherever you turn. So we keep the state, and the state is under threat, as I say in one of my chapters, because I think of globalism and globalization. It's a paradox, isn't it? That globalism is meant to make us all happy together. Oh, what a wonderful world it would be. We all love each other. We don't need borders. What a load of nonsense that is. Because what we're seeing is the counter effect of globalism actually creating more national ethnic consciousness when people are forced together. And we're seeing more chaos because of globalism. And I don't say globalization, I say globalism. It's become a fanatic mantra also, by the way, of the extreme end of liberalism, which I'm going to deal with a bit later. So I'll stress again that geohistory tries to balance reason with the unpredictable. That's all. It is not a theory. You cannot cut it into pieces. You cannot place it into a paradigm or test it. It's an approach to slow down the current thoughtless spiral of globalized geopolitics and helps us to understand the misnomer of national interests. National. It's a huge word, national. It's used and misused often by realists to mean state, when it does not mean state. So as Guicciardini says, our only guide can be experience. Now, that, my dears, is merely an introduction so you can better understand my mental approach. Now, Guicciardini was operating with Machiavelli, a friend of his, at a time when Florence, and as actually my friend Pavel Kanevsky pointed out to me, was almost certainly the laboratory of ideas of Europe at the time in the 16th century. And by the way, remember that this was the same time when the Italian Renaissance architects were helping to design and even build the Kremlin. Just a little thought for you. Huge Italian influence in the Kremlin, by the way. And I suspect, who knows, perhaps some of the Italian ideas of Florence, therefore, also got through to the Kremlin. And I often see, I must say, connections between the ideas of Guicciardini, and this may sound strange, but the way that Lavrov speaks, you may find that strange. Very thoughtful, very balanced, and very experienced, and very eclectic, with a lot of knowledge. And I'm not praising Lavrov, but I'm saying I see connections between the thoughtfulness and balance of, historically even, of the Russian educational system, the way of speaking, and the natural consciousness of history. I see that. And I turn again to the 16th century and Florence. Now, a brief pause. Yes, Florence also was under great attack at the time that he wrote, as we know, and it was slowly on its way down. It was surrounded by people. And you compare Machiavelli and Guicciardini. I see Guicciardini as a moderate version of Machiavelli. Now, Machiavelli, I think because he was tortured, he was hung, he was hung here and stretched horribly. And then he was let off and he retired just to write. But I think that his experience of being tortured maybe embittered him. So some of what he writes is a little extreme. He's more rumbustious. He says, we should attack, we should do this. Whereas his friend Guicciardini, whom he admired, by the way, he admired Guicciardini. And he wrote that, I admire Messer Guicciardini. Guicciardini was more moderate. Guicciardini, many people of the English school of international relations argue that Guicciardini was the man who first thought of and put into practice the balance of power. The balance of power. which is often something that happens anyway automatically, but it needs good people at the helm controlling, to have balance of power, to set off one person against another, to keep out of problems, not to attack unless you know you're going to win. That sort of mentality. So basically, which is like, for me, he's like a moderate form of Machiavelli, different to that extent. I mentioned the English school. Before we go on to attacking geopolitics and too much theory, the English school, as we know, has three main factors, ingredients, which I think you'll understand. Hobbes, therefore the Hobbesian, the Grotian, and the Kantian. Now, the Hobbesian represents realism, but he's been misinterpreted very much, because Hobbes did not want to conquer the world. He simply wanted to have a strong system within his country. But many people, like Leo Strauss, for example, have exaggerated and used Hobbes to justify, geopolitics and conquering the world. Then we have the Grotian, which is very moderate and depends very much on international law. In other words, decent relations between states, not nations, states, the Groot, which I approve of. And then we have the Kantian, which has again been overinterpreted for freedom of trade, but in extremis, as an extreme way, freedom of trade, which can even lead to war and trade wars and everything. So you have those three strands, which are quite interesting. This now leads me to talk a little more about realism and liberalism. Now, there are many kinds of political realists. I would define myself, if I can, not as a realist, but as a realistic view of what happens, and understanding how history works. Well, history doesn't work. History is history, how we work with history. We have classical realism, you have different kinds, but basically realism depends on an acceptance, and there I agree, that humanity is not sufficiently advanced simply to be left to do nothing. And therefore it depends actually on strong states, on very strong state structures. But this leads, I hear noise. How are we going?
No, it's good. I just turned it off.
I like it, good. So realism, therefore, is then overinterpreted and exaggerated to justify the strong over the weak. Now, this connects to Thucydides, or as the English say, Thucydides, who people, again, like Leo Strauss, have overinterpreted as justifying power politics, which is the same as realism, extreme realism and power politics, whereas he did not. In fact, Thucydides was bewailed. He criticized and was sad about the strong always beating the weak. He said it's a sad fact. So he wasn't actually promoting the idea. By the way, this man Leo Strauss has also claimed that Machiavelli wanted to conquer the whole of half of Europe and reestablish a new Roman Empire. This is nonsense, because having read Machiavelli, all Machiavelli wanted was to unite Italy. And all, by the way, that Guicciardini wanted was to have a strong Florence. He didn't even want to unite Italy to the same extent of Machiavelli. So again, this overinterpretation often worries me. It's quite dangerous. Now we get to liberalism before I go on to the actual clash of theories. How are we doing time-wise? Can you tell me, Pavel? I'm not looking at my work.
It's good. We still have about half an hour.
Good. I'm about halfway through that. Now, liberalism, that is another huge word interpreted according to different people's ideologies. We can start maybe with John Locke, who was quite a clever man, and his ideas weren't bad. One definition is that liberalism is a willingness to respect or accept the behavior or opinions different to one's own. Well, for me, that's just common sense. That's not liberalism, but an openness to new ideas. Also, the holding of political views, which are socially progressive whatever that means. But it's also political and social philosophy that promotes individual rights, civil liberties, democracy, and free enterprise. Very important, the free enterprise aspect. But what I have seen, having waded my way through, if you like, a history of liberalism, both in economics and in social and in the individual, is that it is now leading to what I call PCism, politically correctness, and what we call, I don't know whether you have the word in Russia, wokeism. It's an extreme form of saying that the whole world should be like this, and it's leading to a kind of new totalitarian system without people even realizing, in the name, oddly enough, of liberalism. Now, this is, again, I'm afraid, appears to have started in California or the United States, and is currently epitomized by apparently the Democrats, people like Hillary Clinton, and the whole PC movement, and everything goes. And for me, this creates apartheid, because the more minority groups you create and define, the more they start fighting each other. I mean, I find it very strange, for example, that the rainbow movement is promoted so much by everybody, that every group must be heard and go out shouting. This means that ordinary people simply get left by the wayside. When I say ordinary people, I mean people who are not concerned in expressing who they are to the rest of the world. So my own personal idea is live and let live. And paradoxically, contradictorily, oxymoronically, in the name of liberalism, they are not living and let live. They're doing the opposite. They're interfering in every sphere of human activity, wanting to define every single group, creating more and more groups. Take a look at gender politics. There are now more than 26 genders in some American universities, and I'm being serious. This, for me, strikes me as bizarre. And I'm not an old traditional dinosaur. I hope I'm not. But as far as I'm concerned, you have males and females, and occasionally hermaphrodites. 1 in 20 million combines both, but that still leads to only 2 essential genders, with an occasional one with both genders in a single being. So all the rest has gone too far. This may have been aided, of course, by the massive information which we're given. And I think, as Umberto Eco said, we become digital idiots, because a lot of people, and I have to say, who have not had the space to think, simply go onto their digital thing and they read all these ideas, and they immediately, without understanding them, start pushing them out to other people as well as to their own selves. Now, that may sound a little supercilious, a little arrogant. Oh, I know, because I've looked at it. But it is dangerous. I'm not saying keep the information away from them, but for heaven's sake, some kind of a counter movement, I think, is necessary. Some kind of balance is necessary. As I say. Now then, Facebook. Take a look at Facebook and you'll understand what I'm talking about. Very much. The social media are out of control. It seems completely out of control. Without knowing the danger of the social media, it's a very dangerous tool in the hands of some people. I think we need it. We should have it, but it's out of control. And worse than that, it's becoming totalitarian, because only certain things can be put on social media. There are gatekeepers. There are gatekeepers everywhere. So what I'm saying is that an excess of anything is dangerous. And in terms of liberalism, an excess of liberalism leads to an excess of logic and an attempt to impose your ideas of 26 genders and all the rest of it on the whole of humanity. And we're seeing this now, of course, and I'm not going to argue about that. We're seeing this to a certain extent, I have to say, with what I call the health scaremongering that's going on all over the world. People are being made to be frightened, whereas with previous illnesses, they haven't. I've never seen anything like this. There have been very nasty illnesses in the past, but never, not even after the First World War, was there this mass paranoia when millions died in Europe. For some reason, because of the information explosion and because of what I'm talking about, this excessive liberalism, we are seeing fear, chaos, and a lack of thinking. We're seeing so many slogans being thrown about. So there's a great danger in too much sloganization and too much smartphonery. And here's my own slogan: better to have an opinion than an opinion. But if opinions are taken over by opinions, then we will no longer be able to say that in order to reflect and think deeply, we need the space not to think. But this space not to think seems to be moving away from us. False deadlines, speed goes with greed. Now, here we go into the theories. Now, there are so many theories. There are so many theories. The two main counterweights: realism, which I tend a little towards because it has less models, and then behavioralism, which attracts the liberals, of course. Now, behavioralism is very so-called scientific because it uses the natural sciences and steals from the natural sciences in order to get all its modeling and creates models and all the rest of it. And there are so many theories. They're like Venn diagrams, they overlap and sometimes they clash and then they overlap altogether. And I found a little picture here to express, I think, what I'm saying about that. And I'll find, if you'll bear with me for 1 minute. Here we go. It's a picture which I think you will understand very well. The War of the Theories. There we are. Can you see this well or not? Does it show up nicely? That little cartoon, can you see it?
Yep.
There you are. That's all those paradigms and theories and structuralism and liberalism and all these isms spinning around. And there's the poor old chap at the top trying to make head or tail of it and understand it, which is a bit sad. Now, in the academic world, it's more like a rugby match. The scramble for international relations. That's a rugby match. Can you see it?
Yep.
There's a referee, and all these people are looking for international relations, which is the ball at the top, you see, the rugger ball at the top. And they're all looking, they can't even find it, and they're just all killing themselves instead. Now, that happens in the academic world, in universities. They're looking for the same thing, but they don't find it because they're more interested in their own characteristics than thinking geohistorically. In other words, in a detached way, without ideology.
So, William, how do you suggest to catch the ball of international relations?
Geohistory. Detach yourself completely. Forget emotion if you can. We all have it, I know. Be completely technical. Now, techne, remember, is from the ancient Greek word for art. So you could be a little artistic. But to catch that ball, I'm suggesting balance, geohistory, and a healthy suspicion of geopolitics, which now leads to my view of geopolitics. It's a big, big word. It was invented quite recently, less than 100, a bit more than 100 years ago. It was obviously connected with grabbing other people's resources. At the risk of sounding ideological, I will use the word imperialistic, because it was an imperialistic definition. The biggest proponent of geopolitics was Mackinder, who of course called it political geography, because he wanted to distance himself from the Germans like Haushofer and people like Kjellén. But at the end of the day, whatever they say, geopolitics is simply grabbing the resources of other people. If you're a powerful, strong country, you need your oil, you need it, you go and you get it. The other thing, and this is, I can quote here Christopher Hill, who's very good, is that it also imposes artificial borders on what should be natural borders. All you have to do is take a look at the Middle East and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and you'll understand that immediately. Not all those borders are natural. They do not reflect the main groups of people that live there. You have tribes cut in the middle because some oil pipeline. Take a look at Africa. Have you ever wondered why it has all these straight lines when you look at a map of Africa? Because these people sitting in an armchair a long time ago, wanting their resources, agreed, the English and the French and the American, they all said, oh, we'll have this, you'll have that. And we see the results today. Poor old Libya, poor old Iraq, poor old Middle East especially. Luckily, Russia doesn't have these problems. Russia, from what I've seen historically, doesn't need to go around the world grabbing other people's resources. Okay, it's got enough of its own, but it never has done that. It's always expanded organically. Actually, a bit like the Roman Empire did, organically, in a sense. Out, it doesn't sail to the other side of the world like the British and the Americans, especially, and the Dutch and the French, and even the Belgians, poor Belgians jumped on the bandwagon. The new state of Belgium jumped in and did it. The Russians never needed to do that. And that, for me, shows a very big difference between the Russian, I will use the word national here, mentality within the Russian state, and a lot of all the other Western imperially based countries, which is what they were. So you can begin to understand why I prefer geohistory over geopolitics. Now, geopolitics, it will never go away, but we need to understand and control it. This links into the need for a more multipolar world. But there's an argument here. Many people say that the human race is not sufficiently developed as individual people, which is why no corporation is perfect, no state is perfect. We, as individuals, we are insecure. So no state can ever be perfect. So on the one hand, would it be better, for example, to slowly go back to the old system of of the Cold War? Yes, maybe, but without the rhetoric and the ideological hatred and the jealousy and the propaganda. Then it might work beautifully. Paradoxically, you would need to have very good relations between the old power blocks. Or better, are we going in for a triumvirate? Are we going in for the US on the one hand, Europe, and then Russia, China, a triple? There are various formula have been put forward recently. Or is the world mature enough to have a multipolar system, which the French were promoting only a few years ago, by the way, which may be better. If we have a multipolar system, we would then surely have to revise the UN Security Council, add a couple of members, for example. But that becomes tricky in terms of balance. But it is true that the United Nations itself, that the Security Council no longer fully represents the real balance of power in the world. For example, India isn't there, surely. Japan isn't there. And yet they're two of the biggest economies of the world. And they're not on the Security Council, I mean, as permanent members. So we have all these complications going on. So at that point, before I continue, does anybody have any questions? Or do you need a lot of space to reflect? I suspect you do. Because if not, I shall begin to end, because I've gone slightly more speedily than I thought, but then I can start looking at each chapter for you. In my youth, I believed that no amount of thinking would help me to see more than I took in immediately. Young people see, and that's it. But experience has shown me that this opinion is false. You may laugh at anyone who maintains the opposite, but the longer we reflect, the clearer things grow and the better we understand them. The affairs of this world are so shifting, so movable, and depend on so many accidents that it's difficult to form any judgment concerning the future. That is Guicciardini, not me, but I happen to agree with it. the world is moving too fast. It's moving too fast, and people are becoming increasingly forgetful, from what I can see. Not everywhere, not everywhere. I don't think the Vatican, even with the slightly funny Pope at the moment, who's a bit politically correct, but even with the basic Vatican and with Russia, for example, you still have very good state apparatuses that have the space to really look and analyze. Let me juxtapose that with my own ex-British diplomatic service. I've written a book about it as well. In the space of about 15 years, the Her Majesty's Diplomatic Service has moved from a once very serious and respected organization to a fast-moving business. What do I mean? Well, let me tell you. When I was sitting at, and I'm being really practical now. I'm not being theoretical. I'm using history. Once upon a time, I used to go into work as a diplomat in the Foreign Office. I'd sit down at my desk. There was a problem in some part of the world. I was in United Nations Department. And what are we going to do about Diego Garcia, this island? And so I used to call for the file. A clerk used to come in, a clerk used to take my message, which said, please bring me this file. He used to go to a big room full of files. He used to bring me the file. And he brought it to me on a certain date, because I used to put BU, which means bring up, on a certain date. And there it was. I opened the file. I looked only at the history. Only history existed. This is where we were. Now, where are we now to start solving the problem? Right. That's all gone. There are no more registries. There are no more physical files in departments. It's all on computer. You have to do an impossible apparently American system of words and this and that. And most people don't even understand it, and they can't use it because things move too fast. And as the former ambassador, one former ambassador to Iraq, a friend of mine, I won't say who, told me personally, apart from saying Iraq was a mistake, he told me that everything now in the Foreign Office is done on the hoof, like this, quickly and suddenly, without time to reflect. Now, I know that in some countries this has not yet happened, but it's the speed which very often, as a geohistorian will say, goes hand in hand with greed and wanting. This obsession with resources is worrying, because very often a big country says, we need this oil, we need this gas, but they'll just go and get it. Well, because international law is becoming weaker. And that is why geohistory is so important. You've got to have strong international law. That's why I tend towards Grotian approach than a purely realist approach, let alone a Kantian approach, which for me represents a certain element of selfishness, too much selfishness in the individual. Remember that all these human characteristics are always reflected in the organization, in all organizations of human beings. And therefore, the more detached one can be, which is why people like even Machiavelli, yes, and Guicciardini are so important in understanding properly, but not exploiting and not reinterpreting for one's own purpose, which is another dangerous tendency of students and politicians and even state servants to do. They read something they like according to what they want, and they use it and they cherry pick it in order to, like they do with history. And that is also very dangerous. In other words, you have to consider the good, the bad, and the ugly if you want to have good interstate relations. It's tough. It's tough. Now, at this point, I hope to have confused you a little bit. Because if I have, then I have achieved some of my purpose. Because if I have, that reflects the current state of thinking in the world. It reflects the current mass of different IR, international relations theories, but not, I hope, my interstate idea, which is to understand that the only way, safe way, of keeping, maintaining peace in the world is to have strong diplomacy, which is slowly dying, strong diplomacy, almost pedantic diplomacy, strong international law, very strong international law, and controlling the excess of big business, which is increasingly strong in governments. There's too much interaction, I think, between individual people in governments and business interests. And that's why, for better or for worse, shareholders themselves of big companies are an increasingly important part, unfortunately for me, of interstate relations. So it's not that I'm against making a profit, heaven forbid, no, but I'm very much against a concentration of selfish economic forces as reflected in the individual who wants to make lots of money, which then grows into a big, small number of shareholders whose sole purpose is to keep making profits through whatever method they can. And that needs to be controlled, which is why it's best to do that simply through the state, not so much through international relations. And I don't mean to criticize international relations. I'm just saying it can be a fuzzy term, but through interstate relations. I could go on, but I think, where are we now, Pavel?
Yes, I think we can maybe collect some questions or comments if anybody wills to add something to our discussion. Коллеги, пожалуйста, давайте вот мы сейчас ненадолго прервемся, да, и вы можете на самом деле вот в Zoom, да, либо поднять руку, чтобы я видел, кто хочет задать вопрос или выступить. И вот Николай, я вижу, уже, да, готов. Николай, пожалуйста, хотите на русском, хотите на английском, как угодно.
May I try in English, but sorry, I didn't speak a lot, so hello, William. Thank you so much for your lecture, which was quite interesting. And I actually have a question about geohistory as a method in social science. Well, you said that geohistory isn't just an ordinary theory. This is the way of thinking. And do you think that this way of thinking can become actually potential method in social science, which can give us opportunity to understand international relationships as more objective, like without ideology, without politics and manipulations, in more pure essence, pure knowledge?
Right. Look, first, I want to point out that that my approach is an approach of complete historical detachment. So I would accept the possibility of it being a method, but I would not like this method to become a theory, because I consider that a geohistorical approach is above and separate from any of the mainstream international relations theories that we have. So that's why I do not wish to use the word, to reduce it to the word theory, because all a theory is something that cannot be proved 100%. I cannot prove that geohistory is a theory. I don't wish it to be a theory, because if it's a theory, it may not be completely provable. All it is, and I will quote you now, I mean, it's an approach. Let me just, again, I have to go to what I wrote very specifically. The effects of global geohistory. There we are. Look, appearances, tendency. Here we go. It's about individual human nature being the basis of all corporate human behavior. That's a first major point. If you think you can make a method out of that, good luck. That's the first point. This is a thing that has been ignored by most theories, because it is, you see, it's not an ism. I would never talk about geohistoricism, ever. Geohistory, it's simply a tool. How about a tool, a path to better understand relations between states, between states. So I've written here, it is therefore the antithesis of geopolitics. Because geopolitics for me is national selfishness. It emphasizes resources, grabbing land, and poisoning geography with politics. That's the opposite of geohistory. Now, if geohistory became the norm, as opposed to geopolitics, we would probably see a reduction in grabbing land, and we might see less war. We could not eliminate war. We might see less war, with less need to promote my theory or your theory or my behavioral theory or my structuralist theory or my realistic theory or my liberal theory. Less need to promote the theory, because learning from geohistory through looking at the documents over a number of years and the detached thinking that can result is the basis. It's a very simple basis. I'm afraid it's as tough as hell. You have to look at the documents physically, go through them all. And then you see what is in the mind of the people who wrote those documents. Those people were human beings as well. They were trying to be detached, but they're not. Why was this document written? Was the writer trying to please his boss or her boss? Was the writer expressing an inner desire to see what he wanted to write? Or was he being completely detached? Usually, if he had space to write, he might be detached. But don't forget that all these diplomats writing the documents are also, and were also, still considering their state interest. So even modern diplomats need to subtract themselves from thinking only of state interests. They must at the same time think of the balance with the rest of the world. That to balance then state, some people call it national interests, with a broad view, a geohistorical view of every single country, which is very difficult. But one has to be able to do that, to look at, that's why I was suggesting that of all organizations, the Vatican may be one of the most sophisticated in its diplomatic reporting around the whole world, which is, it's just a thought. And I suspect that the Russia will have a lot of space still to do that. Britain used to do it, had very good political reporting. That's all now being banned, by the way. You're not allowed to write dispatches anymore by ambassadors, for example, because it's too embarrassing when you discover what they wrote 30 years later, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, that's all gone as well. So again, I will say, just to help you a bit and help myself, while it may be true that people and groups of people are a product of their geographical environment, climate, location are crucial in developing people, it is geohistory that helps us to look at matters in a detached way, without such geopolitics-related terms as geostrategy, which is another nasty word, which is a linguistically bulimic term for strategy. That's all it is. And often synonymous with geo-killing. Most wars, I think, are geopolitical wars. Most big wars, not all. There are many factors in a war. We know that, personal, ethnic, little countries. But generally, the worst, biggest wars tend to be geopolitical. From what I can see in history, they're mainly about resources and economics, actually. And I'm not a Marxist, by the way, not only some of his ideas I think are quite clever. But most big wars are about interests, which is economics. The word economics I can accept, by the way, it's a very good word based on the ancient Greek. The other thing, and this is for you, because I see you're going to thinking of writing a paper about this, either to kill the idea or not, and I don't mind if you do, if you want to try. Geohistory also frees us from using and depending on the clashing international relations theories and models. It's away from them. It uses original documents, like Guicciardini, by the way, who's one of the first people who ever taught us to use documents. Guicciardini, I forgot that. The documents are themselves history. So in contrast, to my geohistory people like Nietzsche, Hegel, Marx, and others, despite their intellectual and sometimes over-Germanic logical approach, often based on over-interpreting pre-Socratic philosophy, appear for me to relate their accumulation of facts to their own concept of history, their own concept. Thereby, they raise history to an unreal philosophical platform, which in turn implies that history is itself a philosophy. No, it's not. As I say, history is just the past, which is with me as I write. So geohistory is detachment and learning and experiencing as much as you possibly can, mainly from documents, and then proceeding from that for your own country, your own state, I will use the word state, and for heaven's sake, understanding that other states also exist, not necessarily clashing with yours, but hopefully complementarily. So in short, it is not subject to theory. Theories are just part of geohistory, not the other way around. This is important. Theories are part of geohistory, but they are not geohistory. It's entirely separate. Now, some historiographers, and the word historiography is misinterpreted, by the way, because all it means is writing history, but for many people, it's a theoretical view. Some historiographers trying to make history philosophical, or at least theoretical, do nothing else other than stimulate thinking. So geohistory is how you understand how the creators of history, human beings, think, and how they've influenced many into behaving barbarically, often because they took ideas out of context and even twisted the ideas away from the original to suit their selfish, individual, and therefore corporate purpose. So the same basic characteristics, whether they're individual, corporate, racial, nationalistic, or institutional, tend to remain remarkably constant, the same, despite modifications. Even behavior is consistent in its inconsistency. How's that? Even behavior is consistent in its inconsistency. Geohistory is a very difficult path to avoid strife, to avoid killing where possible, but rather than justifying it, as geopolitics does. I think of Hillary Clinton saying, oh, how unfortunate that all these people have been killed in the Middle East. She used the word unfortunate. For me, that's justifying. This leads to globalization, but that's all connected and we're beginning to understand each other. So I hope that was vaguely helpful as an answer, because I think there are ingredients for perhaps not making a theory, but a path, an approach, a responsible attitude, which obviously includes criticizing geopolitics and to some extent the exaggerated globalism, which is leading to the weakening of the state, from what I can see. So let's counterbalance. My goodness, that was a tough question, and I thank you for it, because I've myself been thinking of wondering whether it's worthwhile developing my idea with more examples. Now, one chapter, incidentally, has got the chapter where I juxtapose Cyprus and Iraq. You read that chapter, then you can connect it to all the things I've just said, because they are one of the two states which are victims of geopolitics, and had a geohistorical approach been adopted, they may be less badly off. Now, nothing's perfect. For me, geohistory looks for the least bad solution, the least bad, but I don't use the word best, because that's arrogant. But it looks for the least bad. As the Greeks say, domin chiron veltiston. Wow. Do you have
Thank
any
you, William. That was a very good question, I would say, and a very good response.
an attempted
Uh,
response? Yes, indeed. I was
yeah,
speaking from straight off the cuff, top of my head, but from experience
yes,
and 10 years of
very
thinking
good,
about
very
it.
good. And I like the way you described it as a kind of an applicable tool.
Yes,
Uh,
it came to me, and
that
I
that
thank
is
you for this
yes,
lecture.
that is aimed at analyzing the world in the most objective way, rather
Thank
than
you.
filtering it through different theories. So this is what I wrote in the chat.
Thank
The way I read your thought, which I think is very interesting, because in the beginning of the course of international relations, we had this big block of theories, of course, and we've been going through all the realism, neorealism, liberalism,
Read them all
neoliberalism,
now to you.
Marxism, and
Sub this, sub that.
yes, all of them. And I think that your approach is very Weberian in a way, like Max Weber, the sociologist, who said that social sciences need to be objective, and you just suggest a tool for that, like the way you can use history for that, which I find very interesting,
Only
and very
history
applicable.
exists. Only history exists.
Yes. I mean, that's the
Title of another
catchphrase.
book I wrote
That's the
recently.
catchphrase. Right?
Yes.
Exactly. I can see that Olga turned on her microphone. Olga Khalina, am I right? You want to say something?
Ask, say.
Ольга, вы включили микрофон, вы хотели что-то сказать, нет?
I'll forgive her.
Probably not, but anyway, we have a question in the chat from Camilla.
There are 25 chats. Oh my God.
No. It's most of this is just my spam. Don't worry.
All right, thanks. I'll leave it.
But we have a question from Camilla here. Camilla, you want to read it, or you want me to read it?
Come on, let's see her. Oh, whatever.
Camilla, вы с нами? She can't use the microphone. Okay, no problem. Okay, so I will read it. William, thank you. I have a little question too. The object of geohistory analysis is the state. Is it possible to take not only state, to take into account not only the state, but the regions, like former Soviet Union, Europe, Asia? I mean, there are effects of globalization on relations between states, but states can act as a region.
Very good question.
Which means that states of the same regions share their history.
Right, that's a very good question. But let me say that yes, but only if you consider the state first as a starting point. Once you consider the individual states together, then at that point you can say regions, yes, but only if the regionalization depends on good relations between all the states within the region. A rather obvious example, of course, is the European Union, which is now becoming a mess because it has too many members, of course. But that's an obvious example of, I suppose, what you could call geohistorical regionalization, regionalization, to coin a phrase now off the top of my head. That's an example. But it's not a state itself.
Unless it becomes a state at some point.
Exactly. But and then, of course, we can start looking at the Soviet Union. There's a fascinating example. But then it shows that nothing is absolute on Earth. Things move and they flux. And now again, I will quote Guicciardini, which I haven't yet done, thank goodness. Things have always been the same. The past always sheds light on the future. The same things return with different names and different colors. It's that phrase that did my brain when I first saw it 10, 12 years ago and began thinking about the whole question, having been a diplomat, you see, of interstate relations, because I worked for a state when people kept talking about national interest. And I realized, no, state interest. Once you know what the interests of a state are, things become clearer. But when you confuse it with the word national, it gets muddy, it gets emotional, and therefore dangerous. Security, insecurity, I want this, I want that, etc. So keep it really neutral, but positively neutral. Now, I don't know whether I've answered a question properly, because region also has a geographical connotation. We talk about the Western European region. Big businesses have business regions, you see. Everyone has their own region. We have Southeast Asia, that's a region, fine, but that's just purely geographical. But I think the young lady was talking about political regions, if I'm not mistaken, in which case I hope I gave a decent answer. The state first, and then you can look at the region using the geohistorical analysis of my tool, rather, first. Is the young lady satisfied? If not, let her further her questioning.
Okay, she says thank you.
Are you sure? Thank you isn't enough. Is she satisfied? 10%, 50% satisfied?
We will know later.
Thank you.
You will get a feedback.
Right. Okie dokie. Beautiful.
Okay, so anybody else has questions, because actually we're running close to the end
Fast,
of our lecture. Yes, it was really fast and very concentrated thinking. So Asmik, you want Asmik,
Yes, I can try.
Sure.
Thank you for the lecture. My question is about national interests. Of course, it's important thing, but what is more important, national interests for a state, or maybe international relations, international rules, if they contradict each other?
They do contradict each other even more and more these days, because on the one hand, you have a United Nations law, but then to confuse that, you have interstate agreements. Take a look at the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey and Libya, Turkey and the official Libyan government making one line which disagrees with United Nations law. There's a big confusion now in international law on the one hand. So there is a confusion. Could you repeat your question more specifically? Because I've gone off with my beginning of an answer. Forgive me.
What should be more important for the state, their own interests, national interests, or international?
Right. Every state should have its own interests. The word national worries me. Nation is interpreted very often as a place you're born, and you have many nationalities in one country. So I would ignore the word national completely and say state interest is what matters. It's as simple as that, because then understanding is clearer. Many people confuse the word national interest with state interest. They say national interest when they really mean state interest. So the word national should only be used very specifically when it refers to a nation. And you look at the definition of a nation, that is essentially a place where you're born, or sometimes even an ethnic group as well, because in most countries, the people born in a country are one essential ethnic group, although not always. You get two, 3 generations later. But that's why it's best to stick simply to state interests. And I would even say the word national interest should only restrict itself to ethnic groups and their own specific cultures. Does that go some way towards answering what your question was?
Maybe about state interests.
Good. National is a huge word. I mean, I could start quoting from my book, but you'll see what have. Time is running short, but I mean, the things I wrote about the nation and the confusion and the exploitation of the term national is worrying. The national interest. Very often, people never define it. Usually, when it's said, it simply means what we want, our business interests, in fact. Almost inevitably, business and military interests. And the way the Americans use the term, for example, the national interest means our military bases all around the world. That is defined as the national interest, right? Now, I think if you use the word state, things become clearer and more evident and more open, actually, and less confused by national emotion and ethnic emotion, which is important, but only within understanding the state, the interstate relations. That's all I'm saying. I hope that made some sense. Feel free, very free, to send any questions in through Pavel that you want to if you want me to develop that because I have written a bit about nations, but that's almost another book. But it's part of the book here. Okie doke. What next?
That was another good question. We had this discussion on national
Yes.
interest as well, actually, and I agree that it's quite a vague term described to legitimize any kind of action in international relations.
Yeah, geopoliticians prefer the term. You see,
Yeah, of
the state,
course.
they love
Because
it.
you have to legitimize your actions, and there are very few words that are used for that. Right, national interest is the most popular one.
Yes, it's a vague slogan, but it's using the national interest.
Yes,
You know, it worries me sometimes.
anything can be legitimized through national interest. That's
the very word interest worries me, actually. But maybe I'm going too far now, thinking too
yes,
deep.
yes, as well, actually, because we're talking about rational interest here, right? Okay,
it's basically what you want.
Yes,
what you want.
Otherwise, you have to define the exact group that will benefit. So when we are talking about businesses, and when we are talking about different,
As Lin Yutang said, too much definition can lead to some stultification. Anyway, over excessive logic is dangerous also.
Yes, that's true.
I'm afraid I like Germany in many ways, but some Germans, especially their philosophers, for me, have suffered from an excess of logic, which is quite dangerous and reflects a certain element of inflexibility, actually. Nasty,
I would say you are quite close to some elements of constructivism, and your mention of English school was not, it wasn't surprising, actually.
Thank you. Well, I'm English.
Yeah, I think they also have problems in developing a common theory, but have a different tools for describing international relations and trying to do that quite objectively. I don't want to go into this topic now, and I don't want to categorize you in any way. I think I started from saying that you are your thought is quite unique, and I think it should remain like that.
Well, I can finish with a beautiful quote for you, a beautiful quote, which I think sums it up. One of my favorite historians, A.J.P. Taylor. A.J.P. Taylor. Yes, A.J.P. Taylor, 64, 138. Well, I'll paraphrase. He says basically that a historian, even if he embarrasses the Queen, must write the truth. In other words, I hope very much that my my studies, my writing history, does not depend in any way on the respect and love I have for many elements of my own country, England. There's no connection. I mean, if I see documents that show the horrible things that my country has done, I always publish them. Always. It's absolutely vital, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that is what a historian must do, period. He must not be emotional in a national sense. Otherwise, he's not a historian. For me, I'm sorry to be so pedantic, but that's how it is. I'm just a pedant.
That's good. In science, it's good,
True. Thank you. Thank you. Voila, monsieur. Everybody. How
Thank
nice.
you.
I really must get on with my Russian alphabet. I could have learned to speak it quite fast, but because being a pedant, I insist on getting this incredibly difficult alphabet. The reason it's difficult is that it's connected to the Greek alphabet, which further confuses the issue. But I shall make it. I mean, look at that. This is an old book.
Next time, William, you join us, we expect you to learn something in Russian.
Yeah, I better do it. Let me show you this wonderful thing that I got some years ago. You remember that?
What is that? Is that MGU? Okay. that's a nice. Oh. Okay, nice. So is it the faculty thing? No,
it's lovely. You gave it to me. It's for the 10th anniversary of something or other.
10th anniversary. Is it the Russian Sociological Association, I guess?
Maybe.
Yeah. Okay.
Nice.
That's a rarity.
Keep it.
You will sell it later.
Anyway, there were a lot of messages. The current tendency towards globalist totalitarianism in the name of liberalism is something to consider, and that I gathered through my own geohistorical approach, by the way. There we are.
Okay, William. So we're out of time actually, so we have to wrap up. And big thanks to our guest, William Melanson. I think it was a fabulous lecture, and thank you everybody for asking great questions. I think we had a very nice
Thank you.
discussion.
You squeezed my brain like a lemon. I thank you for those questions.
Good, good.
Nikolai Baranov and Asmil Aravani. Very nice, particular. And I see Nikolai is going to do something quite serious, and I'll help him.
We will expect some
He'll
feedback
help
from
me.
Nikolai.
We'll write
Yes.
it on paper or
Some
something.
critical approaches.
Right.
Yeah. So what year are you all in? What years are you in, students? You students? Third year, fourth year?
Fourth year.
Okay.
Fourth
thank you.
year, yes, and I think we have also somebody from evening classes, which is fifth year.
Very good.
Yeah.
Beautiful. That was a wonderful experience and a tough one, but I think I managed to handle it without slipping on a banana skin. I hope so.
That was great.
There we are.
So, yeah, we will finish now. William, thank you again. Всем спасибо, друзья. Спасибо за замечательные вопросы. До встречи в следующий раз.
Спасибо, до свидания.
Good luck.
Next time.
До
My accent,
свидания.
right? До свидания.
Thank you.
God bless. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Ciao.
you.
Ciao, belli. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, folks. Leave. Wow.